On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ken Kao. He is the VP of Engineering at Rad AI. We're going to be talking about, does technology truly differentiate at your company? And we're going to talk about what that means. We're going to ask Ken to kind of help us understand, when does engineering help differentiate and when does it not? And also, he mentioned something I thought was really interesting, of thinking of engineers as artists. So we'll talk to him about that. We'll talk to him about just problem solving and why writing more code isn't always what the company benefits from software engineers and engineering in general. Ken, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Amir. This is very exciting to be on here. And so if you would like, I'm happy to give a quick intro about my background in Rad AI.
Yeah, love to know what you guys do over there.
So at Rad AI, what we do is we apply GenAI to radiology. Most people think we're doing imaging. We're not doing imaging yet. What we do is we actually allow the radiologist to be able to dictate just a few keywords, and we generate the report for them. Today, they have to dictate the whole report word for word. Now they just dictate a few bullet points and we can generate the report. They would review it, edit it, and submit it. We can save radiologists up to half of their time on a per case basis. And so this is where I think, AI meets a strong mission, and excited to be here.
We spoke about this topic, and you have some blog articles that we can link to as well. And some of the conversation we had was around companies that use engineering to differentiate at their company, right? Because I guess, there are a lot of companies that say they're tech companies now, and there's different roles that software engineers and engineering play at each of these companies. When we talk about differentiating, having engineering actually make that impact, that differentiation to what the company does, let's talk about that. What does that mean to you, just as a starting point?
Yeah, so the sort of impetus for when I start thinking about this is a lot of engineers that I've mentored or managed over the years sometimes come to me and say, hey, I think engineers need a stronger voice. I think engineers need a seat at the table. I don't think we are a tech company. I don't think we're tech-oriented. And so it got me thinking, first of all, if we start with first principles, should we be tech-oriented? Should engineers have the seat at the table? Or what does that mean to have a seat at the table? And then second of all, we can talk about what it means to be a tech company. So what I thought about is tech differentiation is you look at the company's offering. Are they differentiated from their partners? And is it hard for their competition to replicate them because they have a technical advantage, right? A classic example that I shared in my blog is Facebook versus MySpace. MySpace, the website started breaking after about 50 million users. They just did not have the technical talent to build and scale out the infrastructure because they got bought by News Corp, and News Corp doesn't have as much experience running a technology-forward company. Facebook, on the other hand, from day one, hired the best and brightest they knew from their Harvard and Stanford and MIT network. And then they were able to scale seamlessly to a couple billion users with zero hiccups, effectively. And that is huge, right? So while the features they're building could be copied by MySpace easily and vice versa, the core foundational infrastructure that can scale to billions of users was not easily copyable. And that, to me, is a classic example of tech differentiation.
Excellent. And I think, obviously, that makes sense. I think if we're thinking about Fox or, News Corp or similar companies, Target, Walmart, we see these apps, they're very instrumental. I think they've really evolved. They're using technology to facilitate a lot of their workflows and processes. Then you have a Meta, and you have that, obviously Instagram, famous story of having a small team being worth $1 billion, where they're creating technology, they're creating new processes, new workflow with technology. So when you talk about that differentiating, that scale, I guess, if we were to drop down a level and we were to look at companies that necessarily don't hit that scale, right? We're talking maybe startups other people are familiar with in the tech space that don't have 1 billion users, enterprises that are in our everyday lives that necessarily don't need that scale. Where does differentiation for engineering fit at the next level down in terms of just pure scale?
Yeah, I think there are other ways to differentiate yourself in technology. For example, let's say about 10 years ago, we were just developing computer vision technology. back then, Clarify is a AI company in New York, won the computer vision competition. They were able to classify images much more accurately than Google, Facebook, and others. So to them, the image recognition algorithm is their tech differentiation. At Rad AI, for example, we have access to a lot of radiology patient data. Those are PHI, or personal health information. Those are data that cannot be used by other bigger companies to train their models. So our differentiation is that because our models are fine-tuned with specific patient real-world data and not just academic data, our models can actually give better recommendations for the radiology use case than others. And that is also another example of tech differentiation that doesn't involve scale.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think it's interesting. I think, as we see tech forward companies, AI first companies, we're seeing these companies produce products that are obviously driven by innovation. You know, what's interesting sometimes is you look at the mainstream companies and you look at see what they're doing. You have an Amazon, right? Amazon sold books, and no one would have probably thought, if they went back to the foundation of Amazon, oh, this company is going to innovate in the tech space. I would say they differentiate with technology. Obviously, one example, but as the question would be is, when we look at companies now, are we seeing a blurred line between a company that, say, is a traditional, let's say, a legacy company that's not a tech company by its origins, transforming, like an Amazon selling books, now AWS and every type of AI investment you can think of? Are those lines changing as more companies are trying to find ways to differentiate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I also shared in my blog post as well, tech differentiation is a dynamic state. It's not static. Companies can go in and out of tech differentiation. So let's use Walmart as an example. I think Walmart's actually a fascinating example. Before Amazon came along, Walmart was the ultimate tech differentiation. They were the first to build back-end logistics automation software of any of the wholesale companies. And they even had, I remember reading about it, they even needed to use some satellite connection because some of the warehouses were so rural, there was no Wi-Fi or even landlines connected back then. And so ultimately, they were able to differentiate themselves from all the other wholesale clubs because they had technology to organize all the logistics, to do all the shipments, and do everything they can. And so that is kind of a classic example of tech differentiation from a traditional company. Now, the reason why we don't necessarily regard Walmart as a tech company now is because Amazon came in and took it one step further. Not only did they automate logistics, they automate the entire brick and mortar storefront into your website. And so compared to Amazon, it feels like Amazon took it so many steps further that Walmart didn't feel like a tech company anymore. So I think this is an example where Walmart had tech differentiation among its competition. It got disrupted and it lost tech differentiation. And now they're trying to regain it with Walmart Labs, which actually has some pretty cool technologies and papers out. But the point is, like, I agree with you. The lines are blurred because the state of tech differentiation is a dynamic one, and companies can go in and out of it.
Yeah, and obviously, yes, your blog art, we'll link to them because I think they give some foundation to the conversation if someone wants to expand on what we're talking about. I do like the view of it being a dynamic state. And when we talk about the individual engineer, right? So obviously, a company has business objectives. They're going to direct their resources to solve particular problems. When the engineering is directed to solve certain problems, and obviously there's limitations. There might be objectives that are more near term versus long term. When we're thinking about these dynamic states, right? Oh, I think Walmart's a great example, right? We could actually talk about probably tons of, actually, it might be a great episode to actually talk about the dynamic state of these type of companies, because I think we'd see a lot of them. When we're talking about, let's say, a Walmart versus an Amazon, when they are now going back to a more dynamic state, right? And they haven't caught Amazon, but they're innovating. How do they start empowering engineers? Because I think the real question to me is really, how do you empower engineers to be that engine versus obviously go do X, Y, and Z because I know you can code, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something that I've also been working on a lot in my career, including at Rad AI. I think the way to empower engineers or foster technical innovation is really empathy on both sides. And what does that mean? That means concretely, people who are working on the business and product, we want them to also understand what engineers are thinking through and what the limitations are. Why does tech debt matter? Why do engineers talk about a limitation here or that this other feature taking 2 weeks instead of 2 days? On the second front, we also want engineers to understand the business. In order for engineers to truly solve problems, they need to understand the business context. And so we have to figure out a way to educate them, whether it's through shadowing customer support, maybe shadowing on a sales call, or at Rad AI, I piloted a radiologist shadowing program where we send two engineers every month to go shadow one of our radiologist users to learn about the workflow. And so I think understanding the business context is the prerequisite for engineers to be empowered, because only then can you actually understand how to solve the real problem.
I'm gonna ask you a question we hadn't really discussed, but I'm curious because in cybersecurity we have the concept of shifting left. I've actually asked this question a couple of times, and I'm becoming more interested because of where generative AI might help. Right? And I don't think coding engines are there. I'm talking in the future as we start seeing some of the heavier lifting of coding maybe reduced for engineers. And you said expose engineers to the business sooner. Is there an opportunity for software engineers to shift further left into the business, sit at those business discussions where the ideations happening, where the P&L is being discussed, and we're talking about priorities from a larger picture versus sometimes, and again, depending on the company you're at, so this is a generalization, sometimes some of those decisions are made and then it's getting to, right? Obviously, if you're a tech-forward company at Meta, tech is discussed from day one to when you get it. But sometimes, even then, you're not exposed to it until way after, and you have to solve a problem that someone's already decided something on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think there definitely is opportunity, and I think the reality is companies that embrace the Gen AI movement is likely going to be quite a bit more competitive than the ones that don't. And with the Gen AI movement coming along, the key here is we need someone who understands software engineering to be able to validate that the business logic is right and what is being built by computers is right. And we don't actually need an army of engineers to write code anymore. So what they need to do actually is just to be able to talk to the business stakeholders, understand the problem, and then use a Gen AI tooling in the next couple of years to build out the software and then validate that the software they build matches the problem they need to solve. I definitely see that day coming in a couple of years, and I'm not going to predict every company will operate that way, but I think the companies that are leaning towards that way, they'll find that their iteration speed is faster and they can actually produce a lot more output than the ones that don't.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think I spend a little bit of time I'm older than you, as a business analyst, which would have been someone who can understand code and sits with the business, right? We had to actually come up with that term. I actually am thinking, and again, who knows in the next 10 years, but I actually think that role will come back in a lot of software companies and a lot of engineering teams, because I think we'll see software engineers add that additional skill. And to that point, because I think as a little segue to the next question is, when we're talking about this shift left and we're talking about software engineers are good problem solvers, right? They actually know how to break down these problems within software engineering. Is that extendable to helping the company solve other problems? Because obviously they're pretty good at breaking down problems into simpler, chunks of code. But when it comes to actually being problem solvers for the business, where's that gap and what will they have to do to become more instrumental in the business?
I think that definitely is possible. At this point, I think it's more of an individual preference, because some people, their preferred mode of operating is solving more technology problems. So they might dip their toes in business. Let's call it 20% in business, 80% still in technology. And that's what they're comfortable with. There might be some people who are much more interested in the business. And so they might dip their toes and go 80% into the business and think about all the other problems, and only 20% in technology. And I think, is there an opportunity to shift left more? Yes. And I think it's going to come down to each individual's appetite for where they want to operate.
So when we're talking about software engineers, and I honestly, that does make sense. I think it's going to be a bit of a time until we get to all these, potentially get to these states anyways. I think we'll see a lot of moving parts, a lot of changes. When we're talking about software engineers, you mentioned that think of them more as artists, not code writers. I'm curious if you could explain what that means.
Yeah, I think at some of the places I've observed, they think of engineers' job as to write code. Here's a spec, I need you to build X, go do it. What I realized is actually that doesn't truly get to the right outcome. So example is in most investment banks, for example, the business team actually can fund the IT team to build something, and you give a spec and the IT team has to deliver on a certain time. Because of the nature of the incentives, the IT team is actually incentivized to give you a very conservative estimate and is incentivized to only do exactly what you say in the spec. So if you forget something in the spec, they're not going to build it extra because they don't want to risk delaying their timeline. And they also don't quite understand the business problem. If you contrast that with, let's say a Meta, for example, what you really want is engineers to understand the problem you're trying to solve. And because when they think from first principles, this is the problem I'm trying to solve, sometimes the problem can be solved with 2 lines of code. You don't need a complicated feature. Sometimes the problem is the wrong problem to solve. So you go back and you challenge that problem and say, look, this is the wrong problem to solve. We got to solve something else. And sometimes the problem is to write code. And so I think if you only ask engineers to write code, you end up with a lot of code. And it may or may not be good or bad for the business, right? But if you ask them to solve problems, then that's really what art is about, right? You're here to solve a problem. You're here to think about it as art. It could be code. It could be no code. One of my most senior engineers at Meta, his biggest contribution was to delete thousands of lines of code, and it made our devices that was running AR VR a lot faster. And his contribution was the number of deletion code. And when we looked at his PR or code peer review, it was all deletes. It was like maybe a couple hundred lines of adding and a couple thousand of deletes. And that made the device faster. And so it's not just about here's a spec writing code. It's about understanding the problem and thinking holistically.
Yeah, I think the conversation of going back to tech differentiation, talking about empowering engineers, and we're talking about solving business problems. I think it's interesting because traditionally, software engineers historically, right, the old connotation was they really didn't want to engage with the business, right? And I think there's a whole structure and ecosystem built around the fact that they did not want to be exposed to the business. We saw Scrum come along and try to address some of that because they were like, well, let's have business injected but not interfere, which is interesting. We're talking about there's opportunities for the engineers to actually be more instrumental in business, be more empowered to be involved, which kind of goes against a lot of what we've seen built up in the whole computer science discipline. I guess everything's evolving, as you said, it's dynamic state. As this dynamic state continues, I guess talk to me a little bit about what you see having to happen from a personal skill set, right? Like if I want to be an engineer that's empowered to work on business, what are some of the skills I need to work on so that I can actually fill that gap?
So first of all, I think this is actually a trend. This is a wave that is going to be very hard to not conform to. And why do I say that? Is with the rise of GenAI tooling, a lot of the work engineers are doing, a lot of the tactical work that engineers are doing can actually be automated. But it's a problem solving that is still not automatable anytime soon by LLMs. And so what I mean by that is breaking a business problem down into a technical architecture that's currently not well done by LLMs or anytime soon. But translating a technical idea into code, LLMs are doing really well right now. And so I would argue not only should engineers be interested in doing it, I would argue it's almost existential. The engineers who don't do it are the ones who might have a harder time adapting to the new wave of how we operate. And so back to your question, how can I do this better? Number one is understand your users. The users are the most important thing. Understand your users, like dog food your own product, talk to your users, shadow a support call, shadow sales calls. When I joined Airbnb back in 2019, in less than 2 months, I flew my entire team over to Portland where our support team was headquartered, and I made everyone shadow support calls because I want the engineers to understand what it's like to be on the other side, what problems what problems they're running into using our tools. And that I think is very critical. Similarly, at Rad AI, I have engineers go shadow radiologists. And so I think understanding the user, understanding the product is the most important thing you can do to understand business context.
Yeah, I actually think more business functions, just general, should do what you just said about the shadowing. Obviously I was in the tech space. I'm in talent and recruiting now, and I see that gap of wanting people to shadow. And I think picking up really what you're saying is I want you to understand that person's business function, their world, to be able to help them solve the problem. It's very hard. Yeah, there's all these old cartoons of, business requirements about the chair being built, and by the time it's done, it's, completely not 4 legs, it's 3 legs, it's the swing, all that kind of stuff. And I think, some of this historically hopefully will change, because I think we're going to have more time. And I think some of the limitation is time. So maybe we're going to lighten the load on software engineers. There's obviously in the last 18 months, we've had a lot of layoffs in software engineering, but historically, engineers don't have the time to go invest within these business units to understand. So we'll see. Maybe some of these, developing technologies will give us some of those advantages we've been missing.
I think so. I think a lot of the rote tasks are now being automated. If I want to import a particular library, if I want to upgrade from Python 3.9 to 3.11, all those things can actually be done by LLMs and Copilot, and it's actually done better. When an engineer does it, you maybe miss a reference here, you miss a pointer there, and it doesn't quite work as well. So I think a lot of those time can be saved.
Absolutely. All right, Ken. We're gonna have to let you get back to actually doing what you do at Rad AI, and you gotta deliver the the business results. So I'm gonna let you go and get back to your day to day. If someone does want to reach out to you, because I don't think we obviously exhausted the topic, and I will link to your articles as well so people can read that. But if they're gonna want to continue the conversation with you, what is a good way to touch base with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think LinkedIn messages is an easy way, or you can always email me at ken@radai.com. So always happy to have a chat and discuss more with other tech enthusiasts.
Awesome, man. I appreciate your time. Great topic. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Absolutely. That's it for the podcast episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, I thought this was a great topic. When we first talked about it, we were trying to figure out how we want to, what we want to focus on. I think we started realizing that there is an area. Obviously, I was able to consume 2 of Ken's articles, and I think that helped. But we started talking about how do you let the engineer and the engineering team move further into an empowered state. We talked about how tech companies and traditional companies are being a little bit more dynamic in terms of where and how they're employing software engineers and how they're actually using that skill set. I think we covered a lot of areas. I know we didn't exhaust it. So please read the articles that I'll link to, and also reach out to Ken if you want to learn any more. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.